This is a poppy field. Once cut, the pod of the plant secretes a miraculous milky fluid called latex. Base opium used by man as a balm for more than 5 millennia. Opium relieves pain and appeases the mind, and that should have been the end of it. But this drug would play a part in some of mankind's greatest upheavals: imperialism, colonization, the Cold War, and more recently, globalization. Without the backing of states, drug trafficking would never have existed. Released into the heart of the system, drugs have dictated their own geopolitics in the shadows. Secret operations, widespread corruption. Drugs are now part of the very flesh of the world's democracies. From Wall Street to the jungles of Colombia, from Shanghai to Kabul, cartels, mafia, banks, pharmaceutical labs and political parties have all lived off drug trafficking. The results are devastating. Whole populations stigmatized or displaced, families torn apart. Today we've stopped counting the dead. This documentary series looks back at the sinuous history of drug trafficking, starting with opium, which the farmers here call the gift from the gods. At the turn of the 19th century, Britain was engaged in a frantic race to conquer new territories and new resources. With cotton, tea, pepper, and other commodities, the British Empire liberalised the world. In India, Britain laid its hands on a particularly strategic resource. It was close to the city of Benares in the Ganges Valley that the highest quality of opium grew. The British structured its farming and intensified production. With this opium, Britain hoped to win the power struggle against the world's greatest power of the time, the Empire of China. China refused all free trade. It sold massive amounts of porcelain and tea, so appreciated by the British, but bought nothing at all in return.
There wasn't much that China needed. China was the oldest operating economy in the world, dating back millennia. It was a self-contained economy. And so coming up with goods that the world's most advanced consumer economy needed, that was an impossibility.
In this closed empire, the Chinese elite had long sought evasion by stuffing their pipes with all kinds of spices. Saffron, camphor, and one day opium. And its wafts of smoke could soon cast its spell on Chinese high society. In a panic, the emperor decided to ban it. The modern history of drugs started here, with the prohibition of an addictive substance and the greed of the British Empire.
These substances have one very powerful advantage from a cynical business perspective. So the fact that drugs are addictive creates out of possibly early willing consumers, unwilling consumers. People literally get hooked on the substance.
The next step was purely logistical. The British Crown couldn't be seen to be involved in smuggling, so it gave the job to private traders. The most avid amongst them, William Jardine and James Matheson, loaded thousands of chests of opium onto their ships in India and set sail for China.
The distinction between private mercantile interests and the government these were not completely separate. There was a commonality of interest. This was the age of imperialism. Commerce was good for the empire was good for commerce. So these things very much went together.
On behalf of the British Crown, Jardine and Matheson, two Scottish gentlemen in embroidered waistcoats and patent leather slippers, invented international drug trafficking. In the Bay of Canton, the two traders bribed the port authorities and sold their cargoes of opium to the Chinese emperor's worst enemies, the Triads. These powerful secret societies had a single aim: to overthrow the dynasty in power.
Opium gave money and means to the empire's enemies, to subversive forces. These subversive forces needed accomplices, and together they tore the state apparel apart. Army officers were opium addicts, state governors, top public servants were opium addicts, and all were accordingly traitors to the powers that be. In fact, opium addicts were referred to as Han Tian, traitors to China.
In 1839, the emperor felt under threat. He imprisoned thousands of smugglers and had 20,000 chests of British opium destroyed. Jardine and Matheson seized on this as a pretext. Back in London, they convinced the highest authorities that war was the only way to open up the huge market that China represented, with a third of the world's population. So in the name of profit, Britain launched the Opium Wars.
Because of British superiority, naval superiority, the war, of course, ended in a disastrous defeat for the Chinese and a very unequal treaty. And in fact, in China, many Chinese historians date the modern era from the Opium Wars. This is when China, which had been a self-sufficient empire for hundreds or thousands of years, suddenly becomes the victim of imperialism.
The defeated emperor was forced to legalize opium and open up his country to foreign trade. He ceded Hong Kong to the British, who turned the island into an outright opium hub. In 15 years, sales of the drug had risen from 3,000 to almost 6,000 tons a year. To finance this boom in opium trading, a bank was founded, the Hong Kong and Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC. These glass towers are the heritage of an era which saw the birth of what is now the 7th largest bank in the world in terms of assets. And the Jardine Matheson Group, a pillar of world trade and the first business to grow mega-rich from drug trafficking.
The symbolism really was that the colonial power was shoving opium literally down the throats of the Chinese people and sentencing Chinese men and women to devastating drug addiction that debilitated their lives, that kept them often torn from their families, economically deprived.
Following the Opium Wars, uprisings broke out across China, resulting in millions of deaths. The empire sunk into a slow agony. To avoid the total collapse of its economy, China began growing its own poppies. China's borders were finally open. Millions of Chinese fled to the world's main ports like London, Amsterdam, and San Francisco.
And they took the practice of opium smoking with them. So if the original sin was that the West or Western imperialists foisted opium on the Chinese in a way had their revenge, because with this great diaspora of the Chinese immigrant community, opium smoking is transplanted all over the world.
In the United States at the time of the gold rush, Chinese workers provided easily exploitable labor. Opium spread through the Chinatowns of the big cities. Soon, petty criminals gave in to its swirling smoke. Throughout the West, the passion for opium reached marginal circles, fed the fantasies and the verses of French poets. In Europe, opium also made nations heady. The drug would make the dreams of colonial grandeur come true for various countries. France, the eternal rival of Great Britain, intended to turn Indochina into a modern colony, a mirror of its own power. It constructed expensive infrastructures such as roads, bridges, and railroads. The colonization wreaked havoc with the French budget.
People often mistakenly think that colonization earned big money. In general, colonies cost a lot of money at first. So governors were always looking for ways to balance their budget.
In 1882, France started buying raw opium in India and China and refining it in a modern factory in the city centre of Saigon. Opium became a standardized, ready-to-smoke product called Shandu, on sale in 1,000 or so stores with the RO sign for Régie de l'Opium, Opium Regime. France jealously guarded its monopoly and severely punished any smuggling. The more opium addicts there were in Indochina, the fuller the colonial coffers became. The regime would supply almost a third of Indochina's budget. This lucrative model was copied by the other colonial powers, and the British, Spanish, and Dutch soon founded their own regimes. The opium industry would run on full steam until the end of World War II, drugging millions of people across Asia.
Now, there was opposition to this, and in the 19th century, one very important group opposing this traffic was, of course, the missionaries, because they saw the traffic in drugs as being opposed to their essential mission of Christianizing these lands. And so there's certainly tension between the merchants and the governments and the imperial administrations that are interested in revenue and the missionaries who are interested in souls.
This tension reached a peak in China in the early 20th century. The empire had become the world's largest opium producer, overtaking India. From deep within the country, huge cargoes descended the Yangtze River to Shanghai. Within a few years, the port city had dethroned Hong Kong. Shanghai was the new world capital of opium. The European powers controlled entire districts of the city, known as concessions, where the opium trade was booming. In Shanghai, different qualities of opium were available. Foreign refined opium, coveted by the wealthy youth, or cut Chinese opium for the poorer classes. In 1906, 13 million Chinese people were opium addicts. It was carnage. A massive prohibition campaign was conducted across the empire. The Europeans, not yet addicts of the drug, but of its trade, ignored the ban and continued business as usual. So China turned towards a new power.
The Americans realized the interest the ban on opium could have for them, especially as it was produced by the colonial powers. The Americans had no colonies, unlike the British and French, and they understood that by backing the prohibition, they could embarrass the colonial nations, which had become its rivals in the early 20th century, when the US was growing into one of the biggest powers in the West.
In 1909 in Shanghai, the United States and China convened the first International Opium Convention. The European nations unanimously refused to reduce their production. But Paris, London, and Amsterdam would soon reconsider their position when they realized how far opium addiction had spread across the West. Throughout the 19th century, Europe had gone through its various industrial revolutions. Millions of farm labourers had left the countryside and crammed into the centres of monstrous manufacturing cities. With the insalubrious living and working conditions, the slightest cut became infected. Cases of gangrene increased, epidemics were rife: typhoid, tuberculosis, cholera. Doctors were at a loss. Then suddenly the pain stopped. From the fruit of the poppy, chemists managed to extract a miraculous substance. They named it after Morpheus, the Greek god associated with sleep and dreams.
Morphine. The invention of morphine was a revolution for the mind. It changed our relationship with our body. Pain became a choice. It was no longer something the human body had to suffer.
In the mid-19th century, the German Heinrich Emanuel Merck pioneered the large-scale commercial production of morphine. Within a few decades, his small lab had turned into Germany's first pharmaceutical empire. Today, it's the fifth largest pharmaceutical group in the world. From 1861, during the American Civil War, 10 million doses of morphine were given to Union soldiers. During this first massive bloodbath of the modern era, the quality of war surgery also improved greatly. Thanks to morphine, doctors could ease pain, operate, and if necessary, even amputate on the battlefield. The invention of the hypodermic needle accompanied this progress. Injected intravenously, morphine's grip tightened. Patients no longer suffered, but they became totally hooked. So the pharmaceutical industry set out to find an antidote and came up with a multi-usage substance which could unhook opium addicts: cocaine. Advocated by a young Viennese doctor, Sigmund Freud.
Cocaine symbolized modern times. It was something very new, almost magical, a gift from European science.
You would go to a pharmacy, and the pharmacist would have a little jar that would say cocaine and would dispense you cocaine for a variety of ailments.
Cocaine became a flagship product, sold in the form of an elixir, ointment, spray, or cigarette. Newspapers were full of ads. The main targeted customer was the well-to-do woman. She didn't work, so her major suffering was boredom. And cocaine promised to fill her life with a few moments of euphoria.
Throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century, drugs became cheaper. And people discovered that, you can inject cocaine or snort it up the nose, or you can mix morphine and cocaine and you can inject them, and it produces a very powerful euphoria.
In 1898, the industrial pharmaceutical lab, Bayer, came up with a new opium derivative guaranteed 100% non-addictive. The results of the first tests performed on dogs were hardly conclusive. Intense drowsiness, a tendency of vomiting, and abundant salivation. Bayer nonetheless launched its new product under the triumphant name of heroin. Recommended for the treatment of asthma and infant teething pains.
If you look at the history of morphine, if you look at the history of heroin, if you look at the history of cocaine, these things do not enter the world as evil underworld drugs. They enter the world as medicines. It's almost like a genie that escapes the bottle.
There was no cure for morphine addiction. Worse still, each new product attracted its own band of addicts. Throughout the 19th century, the industrialization of Western nations turned living conditions, hygiene, and education upside down. New work organization practices placed the individual at the center of their concerns. The 20th century dawned with new models.
There was a rise of the idea that the state had the responsibility in order to produce a strong citizenry for military mobilization, for national development, that the state had a responsibility to regulate how the body was used.
The unfettered market in addictive drugs was a real social problem and a real social evil that needed control. Drug control, including prohibition, was born of the same progressive international movement that gave us the regulatory state, that gave us the welfare state, that gave us social reform, that gave us protections for workers, for unions.
Prohibition was finally enforced. The United States began by banning opium in 1909. This footage, shot in San Francisco, shows hundreds of opium pipes going up in flames. In 1914, with the Harrison Act, the US regulated and taxed opiates and coca products. Indispensable for surgery, from then on, cocaine, morphine and heroin would only be available by prescription. Thousands of drug users who once bought their daily fix over the pharmacy counter didn't know where to turn to ease their terrible cravings.
If a government says, I prohibit all supply of this merchandise in order to curb demand, it will only naturally generate a black market. A black market that breaks the law. And who's ready to break the law? Criminals, of course.
To meet demand, the criminal underworld learned how to refine heroin. In Mexico, in the fertile region of Sinaloa, farmers grew poppies to supply the American pharmaceutical industry. In the early 1920s, they saw new customers suddenly turn up. The first big figure in Mexican drug trafficking was Ignacia Yasso, alias La Nacha. She bought raw opium in Sinaloa and had it transformed into a brown heroin of mediocre quality by chemists in her employ. La Nacha set up her clandestine laboratories close to the border with the United States in Ciudad Juarez.
Only the border separates Ciudad Juarez from the first city in the US, which is El Paso, Texas. So it's a crossing point for a lot of both legal and illegal merchandise. Everything goes through there. Arms, money, drugs, and a host of other things. All you can imagine crosses the border at Ciudad Juarez.
For a few years, the United States had been living under the yoke of the prohibition of alcohol. Thirsty Americans crossed the Rio Grande to soak up bad quality whiskey in the gambling dens of Ciudad Juarez. Amid this happy debauchery of booze and contraband, La Nacha had no trouble getting her heroin through the border posts. Her family-run business would dominate trafficking for 3 generations, until the birth of the first Mexican drug cartels. The illegalization of drugs gradually stretched across Europe, giving rise to new black markets. With increasingly powerful ships, maritime transport brought borders even closer. The big commercial ports became strategic smuggling points, among them Marseille, where figures from Corsican organized crime seized their chance.
At the outset, the Corsicans were what you could call seafarer traffickers, meaning they were part of the French colonial empire. In the 1870s, after the opening of the Suez Canal, Marseille became the main port for France's colonies in the Far East, and in the ports of call on the merchant shipping route. The Corsicans organized trafficking of different kinds and different intensities. It started with the trafficking of women, then money, gold, cigarettes, and finally the trafficking of heroin, of drugs.
In the mid-1920s, Paul Carbone, a former merchant seaman turned white slave pimp, became the boss of the Corsican mafia. He bought opium in Turkey, where it was widely grown to supply pharmaceutical labs. In Marseille, the chemists employed by the Corsican mafia transformed it into heroin, which was then shipped to where the prohibition of drugs was the strictest, the United States.
Little by little, this drug trafficking intensified. They continued to use the same routes and intermediaries, but the setup became more and more sophisticated.
With his drug money, Paul Carbone bought the mayor of Marseille, had his own men hired on the waterfronts, and bribed the city's police force. The Godfather ramped up his trafficking, laying the foundations of the French connection. In those early days of drug trafficking, arrangements with the powers that be were crucial to organised crime, whether that was at a city level like with Marseille or a country level, a country where the story began, China. In the early 1920s, the empire collapsed and armies started fighting over dozens of China's regions. There was no central power, and therefore nobody to fight organised crime. In Shanghai, the opium dens had never been so prosperous. The triads reigned as masters of the underworld.
The triads were opium traffickers. They owned the gambling dens, and they had close contacts inside the city's police force.
From the powerful Green Gang, one man stood out. His name? Du Yusheng. Du Yusheng had set up business in Shanghai's French concession, where his men had eyes and ears inside the opium dens, and where they wiped out his competitors.
Du Yusheng's genius, and this is where it gets interesting, was that he didn't want to stay a simple gangster. He longed to get into politics.
In 1921, the Chinese Communist Party was founded inside the French concession. The French authorities were scared and approached Du Yusheng.
France feared a wave of strikes and protests against the foreign presence, the concessions and so on. Chinese nationalism was on the rise, and the situation looked dangerous. So the French consul negotiated what would soon be referred to as the Pact with the Devil.
The French asked Du Yusheng to re-establish order inside their concession. In exchange, the trafficker would be allowed to take over all of the concession's opium dens.
And consequently, there were no strikes in the French concession. All was calm.
Once comfortably installed, Du Yusheng offered his services to the ambitious Chinese general, Chiang Kai-shek. As head of the army of the Kuomintang, the Chinese Nationalist Party, Chiang Kai-shek aimed to reunify the country. To do so, he would have to take Shanghai. In 1927, Du Yusheng ordered his men to massacre hundreds of communists who'd taken control of the city and open the gates of Shanghai to Chiang Kai-shek's army. The general soon imposed the Kuomintang as the country's government. But to keep control of China, he needed money, so the Kuomintang legalized opium. Du Yusheng's triad, the Green Gang, became the government's main supplier, and a number of its members were sent to sit at parliament. China became the world's first narco-state. Du Yusheng stepped up his activities, hiring chemists and setting up a heroin factory inside Shanghai's central market.
La grande force de Du, c'est qu'il est devenu Du Yusheng's great strength was that he became an extremely respectable figure of the Chinese underworld. He was the president of several banks. So he was the perfect role model of a criminal gang boss successfully increasing his involvement in the legal world. Again, he was the perfect example, let's say extreme example, of the symbiotic relationship between the criminal world and the legal world. The perfect model of organized crime.
The heroin refined in China, Mexico and France converged on the United States. But in late 20s America, the biggest issue was liquor. Prohibition was making gangsters rich. The Jewish, Italian and Irish mobs, born out of racketeering and prostitution in the big cities, rubbed their hands together with glee.
Organized crime took over one of the largest industries in the United States. That was the origins of modern organized crime in the United States, transforming basically street corner thugs into powerful criminal syndicates.
To monopolize the millions made from smuggled moonshine, the Italian mafia systematically threatened and murdered until it had crushed its competitors. Prohibition created an unpredicted destructive power and widespread corruption. Al Capone had judges, police officers and politicians in his pocket until he finally fell.
By 1930, it was clear that this was failing. There was a government commission called the Wickersham Commission that surveyed the alcohol prohibition and decided that it was riven with corruption. And so in 1933, you got the end of prohibition of alcohol. Suddenly, the mafia had lost this enormously profitable enterprise.
Deprived of its main source of income, the Italian mafia, united around Lucky Luciano, formed an alliance with the boss of the New York Jewish mob, Meyer Lansky. Together, they took control of the heroin market. To maximize profits, the mobsters cut and recut the drug. Their adulterated product caused infections and overdoses. But the end of the prohibition on alcohol also caused rancor and frustration amid puritanical, conservative white Americans, the enemies of all kinds of highs and pleasures. The pre-prohibition fight was led by the new head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, Harry J. Anslinger, an advocate of strong-arm tactics and a brilliant tactician.
The man is a legend. He's a legend in drug law enforcement. He was very instrumental in developing the law enforcement tools and techniques for investigating large-scale drug trafficking, both in the United States and outside the United States.
He saw himself not just as enforcing a prohibition on drugs. He was, in fact, first of all, a moral campaigner, enforcing, if you will, a moral consensus upon the society, getting rid of an evil influence and the male factors, the criminals that were trafficking in this. And so for him, it was a moral campaign.
In 1930s America, Hollywood was electrifying audiences. Harry Anslinger encouraged movie directors to instill the fear of drugs among them. He directed his wrath on marijuana, which was still legal in the United States. On screen, white women tempted by the devil inevitably succumbed. And in the role of the suntanned, mustachioed tempter, a Mexican. Little by little, Harry Anslinger's moral campaign veered towards racist propaganda.
Harry Anslinger, like many other North American ultra-conservatives, considered Mexicans as racially different, as racially inferior.
He made an absolute equation between ethnicity and drugs. Opiate was Chinese. Marijuana was Mexican Americans. And so he was unashamed in using the drugs as a way of stigmatizing and attacking minorities.
In 1937, marijuana was prohibited in the United States. Organised crime would benefit from this new ban. Harry Anslinger knew it and got ready to fight them.
Harry Anslinger really believed in the importance of eternal vigilance. There were many possible sources of drugs. There were different producer nations, there were new smuggling routes that could open up, there were new criminal organizations. So he was always watchful, he was always worried. It's almost as if he felt he was dealing with a hydra-headed monster.
Under Harry Anslinger, the Federal Bureau of Narcotics fostered international cooperation, and in 1932, the traffickers and their merchandise was finally traced from Istanbul to New York via Berlin and Shanghai. During the first years of World War II, oceans and seas were the theatres of fierce battles. Trafficking came to a halt and the drugs ran out. But this respite was short-lived. The first huge international drug trafficking network would lay its foundations at the height of war. In 1943, after the US Army landed in Sicily, its priority was to keep it out of Axis hands for good. Washington started looking for men to temporarily govern the island.
In
Sicily, where all of the elite were fascists, the big landowners, the church, the administration, where could the Americans find men without a fascist pedigree? There were two possibilities, the communists or the mafia. The Americans already knew that after the war, their enemy number one would be the communists. So they opted for the mafia, which would be able to help manage the island's towns during those troubled times.
Backed by the Americans, mafiosi moved into the town halls and took control of the different parts of the island. In 1945, the US expelled to Italy more than 100 mobsters involved in heroin trafficking, including Lucky Luciano, the boss of Cosa Nostra. The American cousins and the Sicilian mafia would turn the island into a drug trafficking hub.
For the post-liberation Italian authorities, this didn't present a public order problem, because the level of drug addiction was fairly low in Europe and didn't exist at all in Italy. There was no drug market in Italy, and therefore no social alarm. So the Italian police let Lucky Luciano do as he pleased.
Heroin once again flowed into the United States, but heroin of poor quality. Sicily was short on qualified chemists. In 1950 in Marseille, Lucky Luciano met with the new bosses of the Corsican mafia, Antoine and Barthélemy Guerini. The brothers had the chemists capable of refining opium to make the highest quality heroin, heroin 4, practically pure, and possible to cut dozens of times to make the biggest profits.
The Corsicans were very strong. They were well organised and experienced. They'd already done it in the 1930s. They had the know-how.
And that's when the big clandestine labs were set up around Marseille. But not only. In Corsica and all along the French Riviera, they refined tons of the stuff.
Des centaines de kilos.
The meeting between the Guerini and Lucky Luciano gave birth to the French Connection, a vast web of Turkish, Lebanese, Corsican and Sicilian traffickers. Cosa Nostra controlled the distribution in the United States. But very soon, the Corsicans, in charge of refining and transport, would gain ascendancy.
The US Narcotics Bureau soon became aware of what was going on with their first seizures in New York. The first smugglers arrested happened to be Corsicans, so the Americans realized that the chain led back to Marseille, to the Corsicans of Marseille.
Lucky Luciano, the most powerful man in the American mafia, was actually scared of the Corsicans. He realized they were extremely powerful, notably because, as he underlined, of their contacts inside the French Secret Service.
Having infiltrated the authorities in Marseille, the Corsican mafia had strong ties inside the French state apparel. In 1951, at the height of the Indochina War, the French Secret Service was deployed to organize the counterattack against the Viet Minh guerrillas, but it was seriously short of money. Paris begrudged having to fund this costly war, and the French opium regime, which once financed the colony, had been forced to shut up shop in the face of international pressure. The French Secret Service mounted Operation X. They contacted a tribe in the hills of Laos, the Hmong, and bought their entire poppy crop, which they transported to a military base in Saigon. There, French agents sold opium to Chinese-Vietnamese gangs and to the Corsican mafia, who turned it into heroin and dispatched it to the United States. The drug money would allow French intelligence to build a counter-insurrectional army of 40,000 men, recruited from the tribes of Indochina.
It was one of those bizarrely clear instances of a modern Western intelligence apparatus actually operating a drug trade. It was extraordinary. There's many instances of collusion and corruption, but nothing quite like that, where the intelligence service of a legitimate government is actually operating the traffic.
Operation X came to nothing. In 1955, France evacuated its troops from Indochina. The region's geopolitics had changed. The colonial powers had withdrawn, the opium regimes had closed down, and China, a communist state since 1949, had brutally wiped out poppy growing. That should have sounded the death knell for narco-politics in Asia. But the Cold War had only just begun, and the scene was set for secret ops and mounted coups carried out by the secret services of the great powers.
There are times where there's no question that before the collapse of the Soviet Empire and the bringing down of the Berlin Wall, the Cold War was a priority national security objective of the United States. And if things came into absolute conflict, I would expect that the Cold War objectives would prevail over fighting drug trafficking.
There's a specialist skill to operating outside the bounds of civil society, of being able to transfer money, mobilize people, create operations, buy arms, transport arms across the globe, deliver them into the hands of people. There are only two kinds of people on the planet that have this sensibility and have this ability: intelligence operatives and criminals. And the criminals, what do they need? Above all, they need protection. They need protection from state actors that can protect them from investigation and prosecution, that can get them off the hook if they get caught. So they not only have the same sensibility, but they have complementary needs. And so it's not surprising that they very often wind up working together.
The Asian drug trade took off again when the United States attempted to overthrow the Chinese Communist regime. Washington gave its backing to the enemies of Chairman Mao, the Kuomintang. 6,000 Chinese nationalists were entrenched across the border in Burma. The CIA sent them provisions, arms and munitions. The men of the Kuomintang made several incursions into China, but were easily pushed back by the Chinese Popular Liberation Army.
Then support from the CIA started to decrease, and these local Kuomintang units started to look for money. And there's a very famous quote from one of those Kuomintang generals. He said, if you have an army, you need guns. If you need guns, you need money. The only money in these mountains is opium. So that's what they turned into. They saw there were opium fields there. They collected the opium from the farmers. They brought it down to the Thai border. They sold it to international traders. And slowly, they start to expand and increase this trade.
With the drug money, the Kuomintang soldiers prospered. But China put pressure on Burma. In 1961, the Kuomintang army was evacuated. A part of the troops set up a new base in northern Thailand, where the monarchy welcomed them in sympathy. From the high-up villages they occupied, the Kuomintang soldiers blocked the infiltration of communist groups, but more importantly, kept a close eye on their loads of opium as they crossed the border.
Everybody knew, of course, that the Kuomintang was the major organizing the opium trade into northern Thailand and organizing the heroin production, and from there on the heroin trade in the region and internationally, of course, also. Everybody knew this. And the policy at the time was security first. We feel that, as the Americans would say, and the Thai government, communism is a major threat in the region. And if the Kuomintang could support themselves by doing opium business, well, that was very convenient for them, of course. And that lasted for a long time.
Opium transported from neighbouring Burma and Laos was refined in northern Thailand. The area across the shared borders became known as the Golden Triangle. The base heroin was transported to the port of Bangkok and loaded onto ships heading for Hong Kong. A century after the Opium Wars, Hong Kong, still in British hands, had the highest concentration of drug addicts in the world. The triads, based in Hong Kong since fleeing the Chinese communists, refined the base into heroin of rare purity. The drug's itinerary continued to the west coast of the United States. The international traffic in heroin had never reached such a scale before. And America, which had used the drug as a tool during the Cold War, would now pay the ultimate price, the sacrifice of its youth. In the mid-1960s, when the war in Vietnam broke out, a large part of American youth was rebelling against a patriarchal, racist, and consumerist society in which it felt it had no place. New drugs were on the market: LSD, mescaline, peyote. It was the golden age of hallucinogens. Experimenting was everything. The body and soul craved for freedom.
To fire up a joint was to make a political statement that one was sympathetic to the goals of the counterculture, or one was opposed to the war in Vietnam. Drugs are very potent symbols. They're not just about getting high.
Part of this rebellious youth, in search of increasingly intense experiences, sought new highs with heroin. Within months, the parks where the dreamers of flower power once sang in unison were turned into the hangouts of gangs and dealers. The number of overdoses skyrocketed. The only flowers seen now were the wreaths laid on graves. And then came another tragedy. In 1969, more than 500,000 Americans were sent to fight in the Vietnamese jungle. When the soldiers came home, a third of them were completely hooked on heroin.
So the question was, who was supplying? Where was it coming from? And so that's what set me off on an inquiry that started in the library at Yale University and eventually took me to interviews with former CIA operatives and to Southeast Asia itself.
Alfred McCoy flew to Laos and headed for the hills where the Hmong tribes grew poppies to supply the local opium dens. Still a young student, he was the first to unlock the dark secrets of narcopolitics. To drive back the communists, the CIA had assembled a secret army of 30,000 men in remote villages and set up a well-oiled logistics plan. It chartered planes to transport men and supplies and cleared 200 landing strips. The Hmong took advantage of the comings and goings of these CIA planes to transport their opium.
So that the CIA couldn't have found out, hadn't found out, wasn't aware, that's improbable in the extreme. If a 26-year-old graduate student with no assets, no authority can find this out in a conversation, then I'm sure they could have done the same should they have bothered to ask those questions. Of course they knew it, but it wasn't their priority. Now, were they complicit in the traffic? Were they principals in the traffic? No, I don't think so.
Continuing his investigation, Alfred McCoy set out to meet the commander-in-chief of the Laotian army, Major General Uan Ratikon, suspected of being the head of this opium traffic ring.
I stood on a street corner in Vientiane. I hailed a taxi. I said, "Do you know where General Uan lives?" The guy said, "Yeah, sure." He took me there. I got out. I knocked on his door. I walked in. I introduced myself, and I sat down with him. And he actually got out his ledger from the opium Régie de Laos, and to walk me through the accounts and show me that he was running his accounts honestly, that he was buying opium in these areas and he was exporting it to South Vietnam here, and the money was being deposited in banks, all run properly, you see.
As long as Uan's opium supplied the local market, the CIA covered him. But the next step was nonetheless obvious. The Major General turned to Hong Kongese chemists to refine the opium into heroin, and the trap was set. The heroin was dispatched to US Army bases. Customs officers, policemen, and South Vietnamese politicians unscrupulously profited from the traffic, helping to poison the young American soldiers who had come to fight at their side. At the height of the Cold War, heroin threatened to defeat the US Army, while it was decimating the youth back home on American soil. On June 17, 1971, President Richard Nixon took a radical U-turn in American drug policy.
Ladies and gentlemen, come on, Dr. Jaffe. America's public enemy number one in the United States is drug abuse. In order to fight and defeat this enemy, it is necessary to wage a new all-out offensive.
The war on drugs had been declared.